sure it'll be a great blessing. As always.
Good morning. Am I? Yep, that sounds like I'm on. You want that Bible? Well, just don't take my coffee with it. Well, good morning. It's always a pleasure to be with you, to be able to present a message from God's Word. I'm Sam Dominguez. I'm filling in for Larry Bell as he is hiking the Grand Canyon or some kind of nonsense like that. You'd think a man his age would realize that when there's a big giant hole in the ground, you try to stay out of it. But well, there you go. Tim's hiking. I think JD's hiking with him too. I mean, that's three old guys that should know better, honestly, than to get themselves into a hole they probably can't get out of. But we'll just pray that they have a good time and that they're able to have their worship service like they were planning to, and that it's just a edifying time for everyone. So this morning we're going to continue our study in the book of Hebrews. And we're going to be looking specifically at Hebrews chapter 3. We're in our third week, so we're going to be looking at Hebrews chapter 3. But of course, as we prepare for our study, we can't just jump into Hebrews chapter 3. I spent the bulk of the time preparing for this lesson, preparing for all of the review material I wanted to cover. And when I got about 2 hours into, well, what would have been a 2-hour lesson, I decided I needed to trim it back. But we're going to go ahead and we're going to do a little bit of a quick review to remind ourselves, because the way the Hebrew writer works is he is building upon his previous cases. He's going to make a case, he's going to give an explanation, then he's going to make a further case, and everything builds upon itself. So I think it's necessary as we move through the book of Hebrews that we constantly review what we've looked at before, and of course there's always the possibility that someone hasn't been here for the past couple of weeks. So first, let's remind ourselves of the objective of the author. Okay? So we have the book of Hebrews. It is a letter. It doesn't feel a lot like the other epistles, but it is a letter. It's written to a specific group of people, but we don't know exactly who. And it's definitely written by an authorized individual, but we're not exactly sure who. And so it's an interesting case study in how we go about determining the validity of text, and also what the intention of the text is. Because when we look at it, when we look at Hebrews as a whole, we can look at it and just say, oh, well, yeah, it talks about all this. But the question is, why? Why did it talk about all this? I mean, if we tend to talk about, well, what's the theme of Hebrews? We would say the superiority of Christ. And we would be right. It is the superiority of Christ. But why? Why did he take the time to write this letter about Christ being superior? He had an objective. He had an objective and he had an audience. Now, I like to refer to the writer, because we don't know who he is, as the Hebrew Herald. And so as we look at the Hebrew Herald, we have to determine what he's trying to persuade his audience of. All right? He's writing a persuasive letter. He's trying to persuade his audience of something. And we have to remember that there's always a reason or an objective to this persuasive writing. And because we're missing a lot of the typical stuff that we see in an epistle, we're going to do some deductive reasoning this morning. Now, we can see, first of all, that the audience of this letter are Christians. They are Christians that he is writing to. They are baptized believers, as he regularly references their faith and their confession. So when we're looking at the letter to the Hebrews, we can see that it's not an evangelical outreach type of letter. So we're not going to see him trying to convince them to put on Christ. He is going to be trying to convince them of something else, because he knows they already have put on Christ. So it's not an evangelical outreach, but it is an evangelical inreach. Okay? He's attempting to edify them. He's attempting to build up the body. Now, we can also infer that his audience are converts from Judaism. Okay? That they are ethnic Jews who have put on Christ. They are Christians who have converted from their native Judaism. And we can see that because of his reliance on all of the text that he uses. He builds all of the cases that he makes on Old Testament Scripture, and he gives very specific and detailed references into Old Testament Scripture that wouldn't carry nearly as much meaning to a Gentile Christian. And so we can infer that his audience are Christians who have converted out of Judaism and are very likely Jewish Christians of a Hellenistic nature. Okay, they're probably not Jews from Jerusalem steeped in the language of Hebrews, which is interesting considering the title of the letter. But the letter was written in Greek, and it's written in an extremely high form of Greek. It's extremely eloquent. It is extremely fluid, very well written. It's one of the greatest pieces of literature in terms purely of its writing style that we find in the Bible, and it's written in Greek, and so it's most likely written to Hellenistic Jews who have put on Christ. So let's consider then, hey, that would have been helpful. I'm changing the slides down here and not up there. But the audience of the letter, Christians converted from Judaism. So let's look at the objective of the author. His objective is to persuade. Now, persuasive writing is always going to try and bring the reader or the listener to a decision point. Okay? He's trying to motivate them to a decision point, and he's either trying to motivate a change of mind or he's attempting to motivate a course of action, a specific action that he wants them to take, or he's trying to do both. And so we have to look for both his objective, what decision point is he trying to bring them to over the course of this letter, but also his method. How is he trying to bring them to that decision point, okay? And that's how we're going to see the material that he covers and why he is presenting that material to these people. He has an objective and he has a method. So the objective of the author is to persuade them not to neglect their faith. That's what we've seen, and that's what he's going to hit back repeatedly throughout the book. Do not neglect your faith. We've seen it in a couple of different places. We've seen it in chapter 2 and verse 1. He says, "For this reason we must pay much closer attention to what we have heard, lest" what? "Lest we drift away." Lest we drift away. In chapter 3 and verse 12, he says, "See to it, brothers, that there not be in any one of you an evil, unbelieving heart that falls away from the living God." That falls away, drifts away, falls away. Chapter 3 and verse 14, "For we have become partakers of Christ if we hold fast the beginning of our assurance firm until the end." And so his objective is to convince them not to drift away, not to fall away from their original confession of faith. That's how we know he's dealing with Christians, because they have an original confession to hold on to. And he says, don't fall away from that. Don't drift away from that. But I want you to notice something particularly. Notice that he uses terms like neglect. Neglect. He doesn't speak about the rejection of Christ. He doesn't say don't turn your back on him. Don't deny Christ. He says don't neglect it. Don't neglect it. It's so much more subtle because we're used to the idea of preaching against someone. Well, you should not deny Christ. You need to accept the truth. But he doesn't say that. He says, I know you've accepted this. Don't neglect it. Don't neglect your faith. But then he uses this expression. I want to draw some particular attention to it. Lest we drift away. Chapter 2 and verse 1. Lest we drift away. The word that's translated there as drift away literally means to flow by. As though something is floating in a river next to you and it just floats past unnoticed. It can also refer to the idea of ideas slipping from your mind. It's just, oh, yep, it was there, and then it drifted away. It drifted out of my mind. A ship that drifts away from its destination because it wasn't anchored down. And you get up in the morning, and all of a sudden you're miles away from where you intended to be. He says, lest we drift away from neglect. Well, that really frames it in a different light, doesn't it? Because as Christians, we're used to getting ready to combat solid opposition to Christ. And he says, no, the real danger with you is that your faith is just going to drift away from neglect. It puts it in a different perspective. At least it does in my mind. And so then how does he combat this? How does he want to combat this drifting away. He has this objective, don't drift away. What is his method? The method of the author is to demonstrate the superiority of Christ. Okay, so when we talk about, well, the point of Hebrews is the superiority of Christ, we can say, the point of Hebrews is to encourage them not to drift away from their faith. And the way that he accomplishes that is by impressing upon them the superiority of Christ. So we have a difference between his objective and his methodology that he uses to get there. And so his method is going to be to demonstrate the superiority of Christ, but not just his superiority in general, but specifically his superiority to all aspects of the old covenant. This is another reason we know that these are Jewish Christians who have come out of the old covenant and into the new, because he's constantly going to compare the new to the old. He's constantly going to hold up Jesus in comparison to everything that they venerated under the old covenant. And Jesus is going to be declared superior to every aspect of that, but not just superior. Okay? Jesus is not just going to be declared superior, but he is going to be shown to be absolutely vital, that he's going to be eternal, that everything about the very nature of Jesus is greater than what has come before. It's not just better, it's greater in every facet. And Jesus is the sole source of that. He is both vital and eternal. He is the beginning and the end. Nothing is going to come after Christ. There's not another big change on the horizon. Jesus is it. Jesus is it, and so they must cling to him. They must hold fast to their confession in him. And so his objective is to say, don't let the common, the temporary, unimportant, mundane things of life cause you to drift away because of neglect. And so this is the last quarter of the year, right? And our theme for this year, you may or may not remember, is that we are people with good news. That's been the entire purpose of our education system and the adult classes for this entire year, is to impress upon us that we are people with good news. What is that good news, and what are we supposed to be doing with it? And the letter of Hebrews reminds us that the good news we carry is absolutely vital. It is eternal. And particularly, we in the church, we must not neglect it. We can't let these things just slip out of our minds. That's a danger. It's a danger to us. So let's look at what we talked about last week in chapter 2. In that Jesus is superior to the angels. And we've seen this in chapter 2. The case was made for the superiority of Christ Jesus to the angels. Now we understand that the angels served a purpose under the old covenant. They served a purpose before God. And what was that? They served as messengers of God. They served as messengers, and so we regularly throughout the Old Testament will see angels coming and delivering a message to someone on behalf of God, with probably the final and greatest message delivered by an angel being the message of, you're going to have a son. And it's going to be Jesus. But we see the angels are these messengers of God. And particularly, the Jewish mindset was that the law, the Mosaic law, was a message given and attested to by the angels. And we see that in Acts chapter 7 and 53 and a few other different places. And so the important thing to remember is that from this Jewish mindset, the Old Covenant mindset, the law was something that was delivered by the angels from God, and it was attested to by them. That's an important thing. And remember, their mindset about the law would have been, you cannot violate this thing. It doesn't change. You can't get away with violating the law. Why? Because it was given to us from God by the angels, and they attested to it. It's an important thing. And yet, the gospel, the message of Christ, is superior. Why? Because it is a superior message. And it's a superior message because it has a superior messenger. The Lord himself. As he says in the beginning of chapter 1, he says he speaks to us now through his Son. The Lord himself, the Son, brought the message of salvation. And he says that message of salvation was attested to by eyewitnesses with signs and wonders. So if you thought the law was important because it was brought to you by angels and attested to by angels, this message, the gospel, the message of salvation, was attested to by the Son of God himself. And it was proven by multiple eyewitnesses, of which the author does not claim to be. He says, we heard this from eyewitnesses. He doesn't say he was there, but he puts himself with his audience. He says, we got this from eyewitnesses who had it attested to with signs and wonders, miracles, things that had not been seen for over 500 years. The gospel was attested to by signs and wonders. Now, the authority of the Son declares the superiority of his message, because he is not just the messenger, but he is also the author of the message. You see, his oneness with God gives him authority that the angels do not have. The angels did not influence the message that they brought, but the message of the gospel is authored by Jesus Christ. He has that extra authority, and yet his oneness with humanity, his temporary lowering below the angels, declares the perfection and eternal nature of his message. Jesus the Christ is the perfect and superior messenger of a perfect and superior message of salvation. It is in every way better than what came before. He is both Son of God and Son of Man. It's important to keep that in our minds as we go throughout the book of Hebrews. He is both Son of God, all authority, and Son of Man. He has experienced everything that we have gone through, and he has completed the covenant to perfection. Both Son of God and Son of Man, perfectly fulfilling his role, making us his brethren. It says that he is unashamed to call us his brethren. And he also serves as our high priest, and he offers the atoning sacrifice. He makes propitiation for sin. The angels didn't do any of that. The angels don't have that authority. The message that they brought didn't accomplish that. Only the message of salvation brought by the Son can do all of that. And so it is a superior message, and Jesus is superior to the angels because of that. So we've got all of that established. And so he's going to move into his next phase of his discussion. He says, okay, you've had this previous covenant, you've had this law, and you knew how valuable it was. He doesn't denigrate it. He says, you knew how valuable it was because of who brought it to you, but consider the message that you have now. Consider the message that you responded to, the gospel of salvation from the very Son himself, attested to by signs and wonders. Consider how great that message is. And so then he moves from that to being superior to Moses. He is superior. Jesus is superior to Moses. And so in chapter 3, the Hebrew Herald begins with therefore. And that's why we've recovered all of this material. Because every time you see a therefore, you got to go back and make sure you understand what he's talking about. He says, because of everything we've been talking about, because of who Jesus is and what he has accomplished, because of his superiority to the angels and the superiority of the message of salvation that he has brought, he calls us to take an action. He calls us to take an action. So let's read together in Hebrews 3. Therefore, holy brothers, partakers of a heavenly calling, consider the apostle and high priest of our confession, Jesus, who was faithful to him who appointed him, as Moses also was in all his house. And so because of what Jesus has done, we are now brethren. But not just any brethren, we are holy brethren because of the work of sanctification that he acts upon us. And he says we have a heavenly calling. He reminds them, he says, we're not like the people around us. We're not like the world around us. We have a different calling. We are not called to issues of the present material world. We are called to heavenly things, to the real world. He's not saying ignore the real world and focus on this magical, ethereal thing. He says, no, don't be called to this fake, temporary world and focus your attention to your heavenly calling, because that's the real world. And why is that the real world? Because that is eternal. That's what's never going to go away. He says that's what we are called to. We are called to heavenly things, the real world, the place of eternal things. And his call to action is to do what? Consider Jesus. That's what he wants us to do. He says, consider Jesus. Stop your mind from drifting to these unimportant worldly things and focus your attention, focus your thoughts on Jesus. Stop and think about him. Stop and think about what he has done and who he is. And how does he describe Jesus? He describes him first as apostle. Apostle. Now, when we think of the apostles, we don't usually think Jesus, do we? No, we think about the 12. We think about his apostles. But the Hebrew writer declares Jesus to be the first apostle. Now, when we think of the word apostle, well, it means 1 cent, 1 cent, 1 cent. It means more than that. It means one who is sent with authority. It is one who is sent with the authority of the sender. And so we know that Jesus' apostles, they were sent with his authority to declare his message. But Jesus is the apostle of God the Father, sent with God's message. So this title is rightly used for Jesus, as he was sent by God with the authority of salvation. You remember how the Pharisees responded to that when Jesus dared to forgive sins? And they said, who is he that he can do that? Well, he's the Son of God, and he came with the authority of God for salvation. That's who he is. He is the first apostle, the apostle of God. And so Jesus is not only the first apostle, he is the superior apostle. The apostles that came after him were his apostles, sent with his authority, with his message. But Jesus carries the authority of the living God. He was sent by the Father with the authority of salvation. So what is it about Jesus that we're supposed to consider? He says, consider his faithfulness. Again, not something we often think about with Jesus. We think about our faith in him, but he says, stop and think about the faithfulness of Jesus. Consider his faithfulness. And here we see the first contrast, or the next contrast, between the old and the new that the Hebrew Herald presents. He's going to present Jesus and Moses. And he begins first with this declaration of the similarity that Jesus was faithful to the Father just as Moses was faithful. And he says he was faithful in all his house. Jesus was faithful to the Father just as Moses was faithful in all his house. Now this is a reference to Numbers chapter 12 and verse 7. And let's jump over there because we need to make sure we understand what the Hebrew Herald is talking about. Numbers chapter 12 And in verse 7, this is when God came down to defend Moses against what? Against his brother and sister. Aaron and Miriam had been speaking out against Moses because of the Cushite woman that he took as his wife, and they declared that God also spoke through them to the people. And then God suddenly spoke to them, and he said, "Come out to the tent of meeting." Now, I'm sure all of you remember, if you've had any experience with children, you'll hear something going on in the back room, and then you say, "Both of you come out here." Well, that don't mean anything good, does it? That means you guys are in trouble, and you're about to get a little bit of a talking to. Well, Aaron and Miriam are about to get a talking to. He says, "Come out to the tent of meeting," and God comes down in the cloud, and he says this, "Hear now my words. If there is a prophet among you, I, Yahweh, shall make myself known to him in a vision. I shall speak with him in a dream. Not so with my servant Moses." He says, if there's a prophet, I'm going to communicate him in with these ways. Not Moses. Not so, my servant Moses. He is faithful in all my household. With him I speak mouth to mouth, indeed clearly, and not in riddles, and he beholds the form of Yahweh. Why then were you not afraid to speak against my servant Moses? And of course, we understand Miriam is then struck with leprosy because of their attitude toward Moses. But we see this statement that the Hebrew Herald is referencing, that Moses is declared by God to be faithful in all his household. Now, there's probably no more important person, no more important Old Testament figure to the Jew than Moses. He carries supreme importance in their minds. He's referenced some 80 times in the New Testament. And of course, Moses was what? He was a messenger of God, right? He brought the judgment against Egypt to the Pharaoh as a messenger of God. But then he also brought the law to Israel. But Moses was also a Messiah. He brought God's people out from slavery and into the promised land of freedom. He was a Messiah to the people. The parallels between Moses and Jesus are so numerous, we could have a class entirely devoted to that topic. All the different parallels between Moses and Jesus. But there's something to consider here. The Hebrew Herald at no point denigrates Moses. At no point does he say, "Oh, you guys have been thinking too highly of Moses." No. But he still demonstrates the superiority of Christ. He lets God's testimony of Moses stand, that he was faithful in all his house. And it's not because, we're going to see now, it's not because of a flaw in Moses that Jesus is superior. Okay? Now, we all could have pointed to, and I'm sure the Hebrew Herald as well, could have pointed to different times in which Moses made mistakes. But he doesn't do that. He lets God's testimony stand. He says he was faithful. And so it's not a flaw in Moses. It is the superiority of Christ. Jesus can be seen as superior. Why? Because he was faithful in tasks that were superior even to Moses. What he was called to do and what he performed faithfully before God was superior even to what Moses did and what Moses did faithfully before God. Let's look at 3 through 6. Speaking of Jesus, "For he has been counted worthy of more glory than Moses, insomuch as the builder of the house has more honor than the house. For every house is built by someone, but the builder of all things is God. Now Moses was faithful in all his house as a servant, for a testimony of those things which were to be spoken later. But Christ was faithful as a son over his house, whose house we are, if we hold fast our confidence and the boast of our hope." Jesus is more worthy of glory because he's not part of the house. Moses served in the house as part of the house. The house is God's people, God's kingdom, and Moses served in that house, and he did so faithfully, but Jesus is not in that house. He is the builder of that house. Again, his oneness with God. He is the builder of that house, and he serves what? He serves over that house as the builder of the house. The house is the people. It's just like James asks the kids at Pew Packers every week, right? He says, is the church this building? And they say what? Wow. Come on, people. He says, is the church this building? And they say, one more time together, the church is the people. Come on. This is a Bible class, not a rest home. We can speak up. The church is the people. The house of God is the people. And the Son serves over the house. And thus he is worthy of more glory even than Moses. Because Moses served in the house. The faithfulness of Jesus is worthy of greater glory because the tasks in which he was faithful were themselves worthy of greater glory. And so the writer respects the position of Moses in the mind of the Jews. He says, yes, Moses was great. You were right to venerate him. He was great. But he says what? We have access to someone now who is greater still even than Moses. We are the house of God. We are the house of God over which the Son reigns. If. Oh man. He couldn't just leave it be, could he? He couldn't just say, yay us. No, he says, we are of the house of God, reigned over by the Son, if. There's a conditional. Remember his objective. His objective isn't just to say, yay, Christ is superior. His objective is to say, stop neglecting your faith. Stop drifting away. And he demonstrates the vitalness and the importance of not drifting away from your faith because of the superiority of Christ. And so he can't let that stand. He says, if. There has to be the conditional. He says, if we hold fast our confidence and the boast of our hope. If we get to be part of this house that is ruled by one greater than Moses, with a message of salvation greater than the angels, but only if we hold fast to our confidence. Our confidence in what? Our confidence in Jesus Christ. The bold confession that we make at baptism when we become a part of God's house. That Jesus Christ is the one and only source of our salvation. We have to hold fast to that. Do you get the idea of hold fast? If I'm holding this thing loosely and I'm talking with my hands, well, eventually somebody's going to get hit in the face with this thing as it comes flying out. But if I hold fast to it, it's a white-knuckled grip. I'm not going to let go of this thing. Why? Because it's important. This isn't important. But Jesus is. Our faith is. Do we have a white-knuckled grip on our faith? Or is it just drifting by? That's what he's challenging them with. That's what he's confronting them with. Do you have a white-knuckled grip on your faith? Verses 7 and following. Therefore, just as the Holy Spirit says, today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as when they provoked me, as in the day of trial in the wilderness, where your fathers tried me by testing me and saw my works for 40 years. Therefore I was angry with this generation, and I said, they always go astray in their heart, and they did not know my ways. As I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest. He's quoting from Psalm 95. And so he draws this comparison back to the house of God in the past and the house of God today. And while Christ is superior to Moses, hear me now, while Christ is superior to Moses, we are not superior to them. It feels that way sometimes because we get to sit here and read about all their mistakes. We get to sit here and read about all the dumb things they did, but we are not superior to them. And that's the entire point of the letter. He says we are not superior to them, and we are prone to the same errors they made. That's why this is important. That's why this is vital. We are prone to the same errors that they made. And so we see the objective of the writer break through. He's not just hosting some general theological discussion here. He is trying desperately to save them from making the same errors of the past. And that's why we study the book today. Because we are just as prone to drifting. We are just as prone to letting our faith float on by because of neglect. Neglect. I don't think there's anyone in this room who is going to stand up and just boldly deny Christ. But I guarantee you there's someone in this room who will not enter his promised peace because of neglect. I don't want it to be me, and I don't want it to be any one of you. That's why we have to study this material. That's why we have to stop and think. 12 through 15, through actually 19. See to it, brothers, that there not be in any one of you an evil, unbelieving heart that falls away from the living God. But encourage one another day after day, as long as it is still called today, so that none of you will be hardened by the deceitfulness of sin. For we have become partakers of Christ. Again, there's that conditional coming up. That's not in the text. I added that parentheses right there. We have become partakers of Christ if we hold fast the beginning of our assurance firm until the end. We don't get to just slacken our grip on these things because we've been doing it for so long. We don't get tired and just let it slip out of our hands. If we hold fast the beginning of our assurance firm until the end, while it is said, today if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as when they provoked me. For who provoked him? Who provoked him when they had heard? Indeed, did not all those who came out of Egypt led by Moses? Who provoked him? The people that literally just saw God through Moses bring Egypt to its knees. They provoked him. And with whom was he angry for 40 years? Was it not with those who sinned, whose corpses fell in the wilderness? And to whom did he swear that they would not enter his rest, but to those who were what? Say it together now. Disobedient. Everything they had seen, the greatness of Moses, and yet we have something greater. Are we going to make the same mistakes? Those who were disobedient. So we see that they were not able to enter because of unbelief. Stop and think. Stop and think. The warning rings out of the text. Stop and think about what you're doing. You have the good news of a superior messenger and a superior Messiah whose salvation is eternal,
and yet you are in danger of letting it slip away just like those who came before us. That's what Hebrews is about. That's what he's concerned with. You're in danger of making the exact same mistake. And I'm going to let the Hebrew Herald have the last word in this class. Chapter 4 and verse 1, preparing us for next week's study, Lord willing. Therefore, because of everything that we've just talked about, because of all of this, therefore, let us fear, lest while a promise remains of entering his rest, any one of you may seem to have fallen short of it. For indeed we have had good news proclaimed to us, just as they also. But the word that was heard did not profit. Let that weigh heavy on you. The word that was heard did not profit those who were not united with faith among those who heard. We are people with good news. Does it profit us? Does it profit us? Thank you. Yes, sir. Thank you.